We are nothing but a divine error, a cosmic accident, something that should never have happened. With this merciless sentence, Emil Cioran captured in a single breath the heart of his philosophy. It is not death that terrifies him, not even pain in its ordinary sense, but the simple, undeniable fact that we are born. For Cioran, birth is not a celebration. It is not the beginning of a story, a miracle, or a gift. Birth is the original catastrophe. This idea strikes us like cold water. It shakes the foundations of everything we are taught to believe. From the moment we open our eyes, society surrounds us with rituals and symbols that glorify life. Birthdays, baptisms, the cry of a newborn child as a sign of joy. To live, we are told, is to be blessed. To be alive is to be grateful. To exist is to have purpose. But what if none of this is true? What if existence is not a blessing, but a burden imposed upon us without our consent? What if birth is not the opening of possibility, but the closing of freedom, the moment when silence, peace, and nothingness are violently ripped away and replaced with the chaos of consciousness? Cioran had the courage, or perhaps the cruelty, to think this thought all the way through. The weight of an unwelcome gift. Imagine for a moment the state before you were born. Not sleep, not unconsciousness, not even death, but the perfect stillness of non-existence. No pain, no fear, no longing, just absence. Now imagine that silence shattered. Imagine being thrown into a world where suffering is certain, where struggle is endless, where death is guaranteed. This is what Cioran means when he speaks of life as a cosmic accident. It is not that the universe had a plan for us and failed. It is that there was no plan at all. We appear, without reason, like a mistake that nobody asked for. Most philosophies of life attempt to cover this harsh truth with comfort. Religions tell us that life has divine meaning. Humanism tells us that life is valuable because of human dignity. Science suggests we should marvel at the improbability of being alive at all. Everywhere we turn, someone insists life is good. But Cioran, in his merciless honesty, cuts through these illusions. For him, life is not good. It is not meaningful. It is not even neutral. Life is simply a problem, an imposition that begins with birth. Why birth and not death? It is worth asking, why did Cioran place such emphasis on birth rather than death? After all, death is what most people fear. Death is the great unknown, the abyss we spend our lives trying to avoid or deny. For Cioran, however, death is not the catastrophe. Death is in fact the solution, the end of the sentence. Death is silence returning, the void reclaiming its ground. If anything, death is a relief. The real tragedy is that we are ever forced into being at all. He writes that before birth there is perfect calm. After birth there is awareness, an awareness that does not elevate us, but chains us. Consciousness, in his view, is not a gift, but a wound. It forces us to recognize suffering, to confront absurdity, and to endure the constant tension of existing. Thus, for Cioran, the problem of existence is not that it ends, it is that it begins. The shock of radical pessimism. This perspective destabilizes every human instinct. We are creatures who crave meaning. From myths and religions to philosophies and political ideologies, we invent stories to justify our being. We tell ourselves that life is sacred, that suffering has purpose, that happiness can be achieved if only we strive hard enough. But Cioran dismisses these consolations as illusions, necessary perhaps, but false. Happiness is fleeting, a mirage that fades the closer we approach. Suffering, by contrast, is certain, undeniable and enduring. Pain is not an exception to life, but its essence. For this reason, to celebrate birth in Cioran's eyes is to celebrate a tragedy. It is to cheer at the beginning of suffering, to decorate chains with flowers. To understand the bleak philosophy of Emil Cioran, we must first step into the world in which he was born. His life began in 1911 in Rașinari, a small village tucked away in the hills of Transylvania, Romania. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a place of quiet beauty, wooded landscapes, Orthodox churches, a rhythm of life that flowed with tradition. But for the young Emil, this environment would become the starting point of an inner unease that never left him. The priest's son. Cioran was the son of an Orthodox priest and a deeply religious mother. His childhood home was steeped in the rituals, prayers, and symbols of Christianity. Every corner of daily life was marked by faith. Church bells rang out, icons glowed in candlelight, and the community gathered around liturgy as if it were the axis of existence itself. But for the young Emil, this religion never felt like a source of peace. From an early age, he was restless, unsettled. Instead of comfort, faith stirred in him a sense of confinement. The sermons and prayers that surrounded him felt less like answers and more like chains. He once confessed that his mother's intense religiosity left him with an uneasiness he could never escape, a feeling that existence itself was suffocating. This tension between inherited faith and inner rebellion planted the first seeds of his later philosophy. Where others found consolation in God, Cioran found silence, absence, and doubt. A country in limbo. Romania in the early 20th century was a nation caught between two worlds. On one hand, it remained tied to a rural, agrarian past. Villages like Rașinari moved to the rhythms of farming, religion, and family traditions that had endured for centuries. On the other hand, Romania aspired to modernity, struggling to define itself politically and culturally after the turbulence of World War I. To young Cioran, this environment felt stagnant. He later described Romania as nothing more than a trade union of failure. In his eyes, the country lacked ambition, lacked energy, lacked the will to move forward. Days slipped by without direction. Progress felt impossible. This national atmosphere mirrored the human condition itself. Just as Romania seemed trapped in immobility, so too did humanity appear condemned to futility. What was life if not a constant waiting without resolution? What was society if not a theater where people distracted themselves from emptiness? The shadow of religion. Despite his early rejection of faith, Cioran never escaped the shadow of religion. The imagery of Christianity haunted him. Heaven, hell, sin, and salvation. Though he no longer believed in their truth, they lingered in his imagination as metaphors for the human condition. In one sense, religion shaped his pessimism more deeply than philosophy. Where Christianity offered redemption from suffering, Cioran inverted it. He took the symbols of sin and guilt and reinterpreted them as permanent features of life, without the possibility of salvation. If Christianity sought to justify existence through divine order, Cioran turned that order upside down. Existence was unjustifiable, an error, and nothing could redeem it. His rebellion was not only against God, but against the very idea of justification. He rejected the notion that life required any higher meaning. To him, the tragedy of existence was that it simply was. Early education, seeds of melancholy. As a child and adolescent, Emil excelled in school. He was bright, curious, drawn to literature and philosophy, but even in his earliest studies, his melancholy deepened. While other students pursued learning with ambition, Emil was already convinced that knowledge itself could not cure the unease he carried. He devoured philosophy not as a source of answers, but as a mirror for his restlessness. Thinkers like Schopenhauer, who saw life as suffering, resonated with him. Nietzsche's thunderous proclamations stirred him, but even Nietzsche's call to embrace life seemed to Emil like an impossible demand. Where Nietzsche urged humanity to affirm existence, Cioran felt only the weight of its absurdity. A family marked by faith and fragility. Cioran's relationship with his parents also shaped his inner world. His father, as a priest, embodied the certainty of faith, while his mother's religious devotion was tinged with emotional intensity. At one point, she even confessed that she regretted bringing him into the world, a statement that left a scar on Emil's psyche. It was as if the very act of his birth had been a mistake in her eyes. This confession reinforced his later conviction that procreation is an ethical crime, that birth itself is a disaster. For Emil, the wound was not only philosophical, but personal. He carried within him the feeling that existence was never meant for him, that his presence in the world was already an error. The unease of early Romania. To understand Emil's early intellectual development, one must also understand the Romania of his youth. It was a society uncertain of its identity, torn between past and future. Tradition held people in its grip, yet modern ideas seeped in from Western Europe, creating a cultural tension that left many feeling adrift. For Cioran, this environment was both suffocating and stimulating. On one hand, it fueled his sense that life was trapped in futility. On the other, it forced him to search for meaning beyond his surroundings. The contradiction of his homeland mirrored the contradiction of his own existence, yearning for purpose, yet convinced of its impossibility. Religion rejected, philosophy embraced. By the time he reached adolescence, Emil had already turned his back on the religion of his childhood. But unlike many who abandon faith for rationalism or optimism, he did not replace God with progress, science, or politics. Instead, he plunged into philosophy with the same intensity that his family once devoted to prayer. For him, philosophy was not an academic pursuit, but a way of surviving. It allowed him to explore his unease, to transform it into words, to wrestle with the questions that tormented him. Why are we here? Why were we born? Is suffering an accident or the very essence of existence? In these early years, the outlines of his lifelong thought began to emerge. Birth was not a miracle, it was the first wound. Consciousness was not liberation, it was a trap. And life, far from being sacred, was nothing more than a mistake. The first sparks of rebellion. Even before he left his village, he was already a rebel, not in the sense of politics or social revolution, but in his refusal to accept the stories that gave others comfort. While neighbors and family turned to faith, he turned to doubt. While friends looked toward careers, he looked toward nothingness. This inner rebellion was not loud or violent. It was quiet, contemplative, but relentless. The boy who once listened to sermons with unease would grow into the man who declared birth the true catastrophe of existence. The seeds had been planted. Soon, in the chaotic intellectual environment of Bucharest, they would begin to grow. Conclusion of Part 2. Cioran's childhood was not extraordinary in outward events. He was not marked by war, revolution, or great tragedy. What shaped him instead was an inner dissonance, the clash between the faith that surrounded him and the unease that consumed him. Born into a household of priests and prayers, he became a philosopher of silence and doubt. Raised in a country caught between tradition and modernity, he became the voice of paralysis and futility. Given life by parents who confessed regret, he came to see birth as the unforgivable crime. In this way, Cioran's origins were not just the beginning of his biography. They were the first movement in the symphony of despair that would define his entire philosophy. By the late 1920s, Emil Cioran left behind the narrow lanes and orthodox bells of his village and stepped into the heart of Bucharest, the Romanian capital. For the young man from Reșinati, this was a world transformed. Noise, ideas, cafes buzzing with debates, professors expounding on philosophy, and a restless student body caught between nationalism and European modernity. For many, Bucharest was an intoxicating stage of opportunity. For Cioran, it became the perfect mirror of his inner chaos. He had entered a city of contradictions, and he himself was a contradiction embodied. Brilliant, yet destructive. Hungry for knowledge, yet contemptuous of academia. Passionate, yet deeply fatigued with life. Arrival in the capital. Cioran enrolled at the University of Bucharest, majoring in philosophy. His choice was no accident. He was already devouring books voraciously, from Kant and Hegel to Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. Philosophy was not for him a subject among others. It was the only terrain on which his despair could find language. But while many students approached philosophy with ambition, Emil approached it with desperation. He once admitted that he did not study philosophy to pass exams or to build a career. He studied it because it was the only thing preventing him from collapsing into madness. Professors and influences. At the university, Cioran encountered influential teachers who shaped his intellectual trajectory. One of the most important was Nae Ionescu, a charismatic philosophy professor who electrified students with his lectures. Ionescu was not merely an academic, he was a performer, weaving theology, metaphysics, and politics into hypnotic orations that left his students enthralled. Cioran admired Ionescu's brilliance, but also absorbed his contradictions. Ionescu's blend of mysticism, nationalism, and existential inquiry left a deep impression on Cioran, though Emil never fully aligned with his politics. What he took instead was the example of a teacher who treated philosophy not as dry theory, but as a living drama. It was also during these years that Cioran encountered Schopenhauer in greater depth. Schopenhauer's view of life as will and suffering resonated deeply. But while Schopenhauer still believed in the possibility of aesthetic escape, Emil was not so generous. For him, there was no escape. Suffering was not only central, but inescapable. The insomniac. One of the defining features of Cioran's university years was his insomnia. He suffered from chronic sleeplessness, sometimes going days without rest. At night, while his peers slept, Emil wandered the streets of Bucharest, drifting beneath the dim lights, haunted by thoughts that refused to leave him. Insomnia, he later said, was both a curse and a revelation. It stripped away illusions, laying bare the naked absurdity of existence. While others lived within the protective rhythm of sleep and routine, Emil was awake at the most unbearable hours, staring into the void. This nocturnal wandering gave his thought a raw intensity. He would later write that insomnia is the most profound experience one can have of the human condition, because it exposes the mind to itself without mercy. His nights in Bucharest were not merely sleepless, they were the crucible in which his philosophy was forged. A life among students and cafes. Cioran was not a solitary hermit during these years. He engaged intensely with fellow students, writers, and intellectuals in the cafes of Bucharest. The city's bohemian culture offered him a stage to debate, to provoke, to unsettle. He was witty, sharp, capable of turning conversation into a duel. But beneath the brilliance was despair. Friends often remarked that Emil combined humor with nihilism, able to make others laugh even as he spoke of death and futility. He was charismatic, yet inwardly fragile, magnetic, yet already disillusioned with life. First steps as a writer. In Bucharest, Cioran began to write seriously. His first major work, published in 1934 when he was only 23 years old, was titled On the Heights of Despair. The book was born directly out of his insomnia and youthful melancholy. Written in a feverish, aphoristic style, the book rejected the systematic tone of philosophy in favor of raw fragments. It was less argument than confession, less analysis than cry. Emil poured his sleepless nights, his disgust with life, his ironic humor into sentences that cut like blades. The book shocked Romanian literary circles. Here was a young man, barely past adolescence, writing not with hope or ambition, but with the conviction that life itself was unbearable. Critics recognized his genius, but also feared his radical pessimism. Some dismissed him as a decadent, others as a prophet of despair. Restlessness and revolt. Despite his academic success, Cioran grew restless with Bucharest. He despised the bureaucratic side of university life, the exams, the rules, the mechanical progression of education. For him, true thought could never be confined within institutional walls. He longed for Europe, for Paris, Berlin, Vienna, places where philosophy was alive in the cafes and universities, where culture had weight, where history itself seemed to move. Romania, to him, felt provincial, stagnant, and suffocating. This restless longing was part of his broader temperament. Cioran was never able to settle, never able to belong fully to a place or a people. Even in Bucharest, surrounded by peers, he felt like an outsider. His spirit was perpetually in exile, even before he physically left his homeland. Politics and disillusionment. During these years, Romania was also in political turmoil. Fascism, nationalism, and communism were competing for dominance. Many young intellectuals, including some of Cioran's friends, were drawn to the radical politics of the Iron Guard, a far-right movement blending nationalism with mysticism. Cioran himself flirted briefly with these currents, swept up by the fever of his generation, but like others, he never committed fully. His temperament was too skeptical, too ironic, too disillusioned to be captured entirely by ideology. Later in life, he deeply regretted this flirtation, calling it one of the great mistakes of his youth. This episode revealed both his vulnerability and his strength. He was susceptible to the allure of passion and intensity, yet ultimately he could not bind himself to any collective belief. His deepest allegiance was always to doubt. The inner crisis. By the time he finished his studies in Bucharest, Emil was already living in crisis. He was young, brilliant, and yet convinced that existence was a disaster. His first book had given him recognition, but it had not given him peace. If anything, it had confirmed his despair. He stood at a crossroads. Stay in Romania, where he felt suffocated, or leave for Europe, where he might encounter broader horizons. His choice was clear. He had to leave, but he carried with him not only ambition, but also exhaustion. For Emil, Bucharest was never just a city. It was a crucible. It gave him insomnia, mentors, friends, enemies, and his first taste of literary fame. But it also deepened his disillusionment, convincing him that neither education nor society could rescue him from the catastrophe of birth.